pleasure to be here this evening. And a special pleasure because we came through what might have approximated to Noah's flood on the way from Glasgow to Grangemouth. It really was pretty tough, and only when I got to Grangemouth did the rain relent a bit. And it's really good to be here. It's good to see so many of you. And thank you for the opportunity to come and talk about the subject of God and science. I've done a lot of talks on this theme over the years, but interestingly, the pandemic put an end to a lot of the programme that I was involved in. And so this is the first, I think, for a while that I've had the opportunity to talk about this subject. So if I seem a wee bit rusty in places, you'll know the reason. Now, I just wanted to say to you, I brought some books with me that, for those of you who are interested, you may wish to follow up with these. If I just mention them now, and they're over there. David Galloway, my colleague, and I put together a book. I think it was really during the first half of the pandemic we wrote this book called Follow the Science. And there's some of the things I'll talk about tonight in this book. And I also wrote a few years ago a book about my life and some of the things that were important to me, and there's a couple of chapters in here that would touch on our subject tonight. I've called this Born in the Golden Age, just a reflection of my thankfulness to God for the world I was born into. I was born in the last few weeks of the Second World War. I was born 3 weeks before the end of the Second World War. I was actually born on the same day that President Roosevelt died. The two events were unconnected, of course. When I think about the world I was born into, coming just to the end of a dreadful war and our country bankrupt, and yet within a decade this country was back on its feet again, and I think of the kind of life that I've enjoyed: school, university, a job as a teacher, and eventually at various levels of the education service. And I look back and think, this has been a golden age. I hope our children experience something like it. I think many of us here tonight probably resonate with what I'm saying. So I've written a little bit about that, and the book is there. There's also a little book, this is a small version of it, there's a larger version of it there, called An Introduction to Intelligent Design, which has been one of my passions over the last number of years, and that's available. And there's also a few copies of a book written for school students and perhaps university students too, entitled Explore Evolution, and there's a few copies of that. Now, please take them. If you can give me £5 for the books, then that's fine, but if you haven't got money with you and you want the book, just take it, and £1 for this one would be fine. £5 for this one. And there's a few copies of a DVD. I think I've only got a small number of these, called Expelled, No Intelligence Allowed. And that's quite a remarkable video, and there's a few copies of that. If you could leave me 10 for that, that would be fine. But as I say, I'm not here to make money out of books, I'm here just to make them available to you. And if you haven't got money, and if you're a student, just help yourself to it. Is that all right?
That's perfect, that was really taken.
All right, thanks very much. So thank you for the opportunity to speak to you on this subject of whether God and science is compatible. Now, just a little bit about my own experience. I was brought up in a Christian family. I chose to become a Christian when I was in my early teens, and I have worked through my Christian faith for most of my life. I had the opportunity to go to university, and I studied chemistry at university. I was fascinated by the structure of the universe in terms of atoms and molecules. I had a marvellous chemistry teacher who inspired me. In fact, when he knew of my interest in chemistry, he managed to get me a centrifuge. He said he got it from a friend in the police service, but I was told it was all above board. And I had this little chemistry set and a little laboratory of my own at home. And I had that kind of interest in chemistry, and that's what I chose to study at university. And the fascination was how we could understand the material world, the material universe, in terms of atoms and molecules. And I just was fascinated by that. Now, it never occurred to me that people would think there was no God behind this, but increasingly over the years, I stayed on the university, did a research degree, and then I began to realise that there was a growing feeling that because of the advances of science, we didn't need God anymore because we understood how things worked and how the universe was put together. We didn't need God. And I've always been puzzled that that's been a position that scientists who are, on the whole, critical thinkers would settle for, because it does beg all sorts of questions. Just knowing how things work, just knowing how the world is made up, doesn't seem to me to lead automatically to believing that there's no mind or there's no creator behind it. So let's try and explore that a little tonight. Now, I'll show you a photograph here of the lens. Well, it's not the lens of my eye, it's the retina of my eye. I was getting a check for something in an optician once when I was in Shetland, of all places. I'd hurt my eye, and I went to just get it checked up, and the optician who was looking at me took this photograph and decided there wasn't anything much wrong with me. And I said to her, could I have a copy of that? She said, well, why would you want that? I said, well, you know, I give talks about science and faith, and I would quite like to have that to show. She said, you can't be a scientist and believe in God, surely. Which was an interesting reaction. She came from New Zealand. I don't think that's relevant to the story. But, so I got talking to her a little bit about my interest in science and the sort of things I talked about, and about faith and what was the apparent design of the universe. And I said to her, I'm surprised that someone who looks closely at eyes and at retinas and the working of the human eye would think that somehow or other this was the result of chance. And we talked for a while, and then as I was leaving, she said to me, thanks for that, she said, I'm going to think about this for the rest of the day. I don't know what the outcome of that would be because I didn't meet her again, but it was an interesting experience. And another experience I had was with a panellist. I was invited once to speak to the sixth form, not to speak, to be part of a panel for a sixth form debate in one of the schools in the west of Scotland. Incidentally, I just realised today panellist has 2 L's in it. So that's the American spelling. They're a bit more economical with the letters. So one of the first questions that was asked of the panel that day was, does the panel believe that the scientific explanation for the origin of the universe is the best explanation? And there was a long pause, and I said, well, let me start by saying, I said, I wasn't actually aware that science had an explanation for the origin of the universe. I said, I'm aware that they have some theories and some hypotheses, but I didn't actually think there was a complete explanation of it. And so one of the other members of the panel, I think from the Humanist Society, seemed quite irritated at that and got involved in a rather heated debate about God. He said, you bring God into everything. And I said, well, I didn't actually mention God. I just said I didn't think there was a complete explanation. And he said this very odd thing to me. He said, why can't you just believe the universe was always there? And I said to him, I thought that was your problem about God. And at that point he kind of looked at me and smiled and kind of realised that there was a certain lack of logic in the debate. Why can't you just believe the universe was always there? And I said, well, you find it hard to believe that God was always there. One of the remarkable things about the drift in science to believe that science makes God unnecessary is to realise that the great pioneers of modern science, almost all of them were theists, and many of them were indeed Christians. Sir Isaac Newton, one of the greatest scientists of all time, talking about the laws of gravity and the orbits of the planets, says this most beautiful system of the sun, planets and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. This being governs all things. And it's one of the astonishing memory failures of our time that the development of science in the West, which is a remarkable thing and has brought remarkable benefits to the whole world, was actually led mostly by individuals who were believers in God, and many of whom were Christians. And that's the most interesting thing to reflect on. Did Einstein believe in God? Well, Somebody once accused Einstein of being an atheist, and he denied that. And on another occasion he said, I want to know God's thoughts. The rest are details. Now, there are not many people with an insight into the operation of the universe and the laws of the universe. Not many would surpass Einstein. But here's Einstein talking about God's thoughts. And there's a kind of sense of something greater and something bigger. Even Charles Darwin, in his original book, The Origin of Species, talks about there's a grandeur in this view of life having been originally breathed by the Creator into a few forms or into one. Now, some people say that Darwin didn't actually believe in a Creator and that he only put this in to please his wife, who I believe was a devout Anglican. But actually, that's what he said. And there was a sense of something bigger and something beyond the natural world that he spent so much time thinking about. However, there are some quite militant advocates of the fact that science and God are incompatible. The late Richard Lewontin, professor of biology at Harvard, made this rather interesting and challenging statement. But just let's take a moment to read it. Our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is the key to an understanding of the real struggle between science and the supernatural. Now look at what he says. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of the extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just-so stories. And here's the reason why there is, in the minds of many people, a conflict between science and God. We have a prior commitment, to materialism. Now, that is certainly the key to this debate, a commitment to materialism. Now, I've done enough science, and I know enough science, to understand that when you're looking for scientific explanations, you're not looking for miracles or magic. You're looking for logical, natural, material explanations. Science is done by looking at the evidence and trying to tease out from that the laws that apply to it. It's what's known as methodological naturalism. Scientists don't go looking for miracles. They go looking for laws and processes that will explain the natural world. That is the nature of science. Methodological naturalism. But what happens is that methodological naturalism becomes philosophical naturalism. That is, there is nothing beyond the material. We study the material, we look for material explanations, and by the way, there is nothing beyond the material. And that is clearly a step too far, because that is a step that is not dictated by the logic of looking at natural processes. In fact, Lewontin admits this. It's not that the methods and institutions of science compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world. On the contrary, we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Now, he's been very honest here. Now, look at his last statement. That materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. And here's the problem. We can't allow any appeal to a creator beyond nature. And I think you can see that is a philosophical decision. It's not a decision that's compelled by the nature of the world we are in. Our intuition suggests that you don't have a universe like this without there being some cause of the universe. But Lewontin is saying simply, we can't allow a divine foot in the door. And there are many young scientists and many professional scientists who would subscribe to that. We don't want any explanation of things that involves a creator. And my argument to that would be that this is an unnecessary, absolutely unnecessary position, and one that is, in fact, wrong. Now, Professor Stephen Hawking, the late professor, brilliant man, brilliant mind, on one occasion wrote, because there is a law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself out of nothing. Does anybody see a problem with that? Because there is a law of gravity, the universe will create itself out of nothing. Well, the problem is, if there's a law of gravity, it's not nothing. The law of gravity is something. And if there's something, you can't call it nothing. And John Lennox, one of the foremost Christian apologists in this area, has written, and these are his words, not mine, what all this goes to show is that nonsense remains nonsense, even when talked by world-famous scientists. Now, he's not dismissing world-famous scientists, he's just saying that no matter how intelligent you are, no matter how clever you are, no matter how distinguished you are, you can still make some pretty basic mistakes. And nonsense is nonsense, even when talked by world-famous scientists. Lord Rees, the Astronomer Royal, on another occasion has written something like this: we know how simple life evolved into our present biosphere. Well, some of us might want to discuss that with them. However, but we don't know how first life was generated from a soup of chemicals. And this interesting statement, it might have involved a fluke so rare that it happened only once in the entire galaxy, like shuffling a whole pack of cards into perfect order. On the other hand, this crucial transition might have almost been inevitable given the right environment. Not quite sure I understand that last bit. But I do wonder about it involved a fluke. And so I suppose you're left now with a decision. Do you want to believe that the universe is a fluke? Or do you not rather think that there is some mind or some intelligence behind it? So that's kind of the debate that we find ourselves in. Let's play this little bit of film and see what you make of it.
As a scientist,
Microbiologist,
Biochemist,
as a geologist,
neuroscientist,
physician,
biologist and an engineer.
I think there is overwhelming evidence for intelligent design in nature.
I see intelligent design in the history of life.
in the genetic code of life.
in the molecular machines inside our cells,
In the complexity of life.
in the information embedded in living things,
in the operation of the human brain,
In features of the human body.
in the chicken and egg causal circularity of life.
As a mathematician, I see great evidence of purpose in the universe.
As a molecular biologist, I see evidence for design everywhere I look, pretty much.
Nature is incomprehensible without inference to purpose and to intelligent design. The properties of the universe as a whole, and our planet in particular, were fine-tuned for our benefit and for our life.
In my view, the fossil evidence clearly points towards intelligent design.
I see life as designed because when I look at life at the molecular level, I see exquisite engineering.
all cells contain DNA, which include lots of information. And information is only the product of the mind.
Darwin thought living cells are just blobs of jelly. But when I look in a living cell, I see evidence of factories, machines, three-dimensional architectures, enormous amounts of encoded information.
There's power generators, there's manufacturing plants.
Life contains many features that we know from experience only arise from the activity of intelligent agents.
The genetic code is like a software program. It's like somebody would have had to be a coder, would have had to form this particular genetic code. When I see that order and design, I have a really hard time believing that random mutation and natural selection alone can cause the complexity and the diversity we see in life.
When you look at nature at large, what you see is incredible examples of innovation which surpass human technology. Examples include the flight capabilities of a hummingbird, sonar in bats, and greater innovation always implies greater intelligence from the designer.
If you read the message from the molecules, it's really clear. They say clearly, intelligent design, intelligent design, intelligent design is the source of life.
Now, you probably are aware of the phrase intelligent design and you're probably aware that it gets hugely criticised, and if you look at the critical literature, it's equated with Bible bashing and young earth creationists and the like. Now, I have found myself involved to a limited extent, a small extent, in the intelligent design movement, and it's unfortunate that the phrase intelligent design has become something of a parody and a joke amongst scientists. Actually, it's got nothing to do with Bible interpretation or with creationist views. What it is an attempt to argue that if you look at the nature of nature, what it imposes upon you is a clear impression of design. Now, we take design for granted. You know, there's none of us would believe that the tables or the cups or the knives and the forks somehow all arose by some kind of whirlwind or some kind of explosion. We know what design is. In fact, we understand design so well that we don't stop to think about whether something is random or is designed. And what these scientists are talking about, and many of these scientists have distinguished careers in science, is that when you look at nature, there is a compelling and overwhelming sense that this is designed. Not a fluke, not an accident, but designed to be the way it is. And I'm going to try, if I can, say just a little more about this. But interestingly, Tim Stanley, a very sophisticated and intelligent journalist, writing about Follow the Science. I think this article from memory was about COVID. But what he says is, the point is that science is not a religion or an ideology with all the certainties those entail. It is a method of analysis, and as such, it ought to be accompanied by doubt and debate. Now, we have got used to people saying, that's a scientific conclusion, therefore that's an absolute fact. Now, many of the conclusions of modern science are as close to fact as you can get. But scientific conclusions are always open to doubt and to revision. That's the nature of science, accompanied by doubt and by debate. And it's actually very difficult to have that kind of debate in the current climate around science and design. Now, here's a book I bought when I was a young chemistry teacher. I think this is maybe back in the 50s. I can't quite remember when I got this book, but I used to enjoy teaching the six-year chemistry, and we had a single period and 3 doubles, and the single period wasn't much use for experimental work. So we talked about science and some of its wider aspects, and one of the things that I found pupils were remarkably interested in was the whole question of DNA, whose molecular structure was elucidated by James Watson and Francis Crick in 1953. And Stephen Meyer, whom you saw earlier, said, you know, they solved one mystery, the structure of DNA, but they created another. And the other mystery that they uncovered was the information content that's carried in DNA. That's a diagram of the DNA molecule. Those of you who have done chemistry will have some kind of feel for this. It is a molecular structure made of atoms and chemical units in a double helix. And across the strands of the double helix are these chemical units, here shown by letters, guanine, cytosine, adenine, thymine. And these are the units that hold the strand together. And of course, the double strand of DNA opens itself and makes copies, and so on. Now, this is the most sophisticated piece of chemistry that you could possibly imagine. Each cell in our body has about 6 feet of DNA. Each cell has about 6 feet of DNA in the nucleus of each cell in our body. And our bodies can have anything up to 100 trillion cells, I think, if I've got that right. And somebody has worked out that if you could take all the strands of DNA in our body, in every cell in our body, and join it together in a line, but don't try this, join it together in a line, you would get a line of DNA that would reach to the moon and back. I think I'm right in saying about 200,000 times. So you know, there's nothing trivial about this. I mean, this is phenomenal. Every cell in our body carries the 6 feet of DNA that codes for human beings. Now, most of us spend most of our life with computers, with phones, and all these things are all run by software. Bill Gates once said that DNA is more sophisticated than all the software he has ever created. Now think about that. DNA is more sophisticated than all the software he ever created. And Bill Gates didn't get his software by opening the windows of his laboratory and letting the weather blow through. He got it by employing the most able computer experts and software experts to write the programs that run the modern world. Now, just try and get a sense that our bodies are run by chemical software in the same sort of way. Every cell in our body carries a complete set of genetic information that produces human beings and controls and guides and leads and makes life as we know it possible. And what Stephen Meyer had to say in that earlier clip is that what we are looking at is not just chemistry, but we are looking at mind. Because information never arises randomly, it arises by predetermined thought and design. It is the product of mind. And what the modern design argument has argued is that when you find in nature an information source as complex as that in our DNA, the scientific conclusion to draw from that is that there is a mind behind that. You're never going to get that randomly. And here is the individual that I first heard talking about intelligent design. He's written a very interesting book called Signature in the Cell, DNA and the Evidence for Intelligent Design. How did the information in DNA arise? And his conclusion is that intelligent mind is the only known source of specified functional information, like newsprint or computer software. And what he's arguing is that you don't get newsprint and you don't get computer software by accidents. You don't get it by leaving it for tens of years to see if it will come together. No, it only comes together as information because an intelligent mind put it that way. And so my argument would be, as his argument is, that the scientific conclusion to draw from the information content of life carried largely in our DNA is that it is the product of intelligence, of a supreme intelligence. And for that reason, I would argue that there is no way in which to believe in God or in a supreme mind conflicts with science. It seems to me to be the obvious conclusion that you would draw from scientific investigation. In June 2000, there was a transatlantic press conference with Bill Clinton and Tony Blair to celebrate the completion of the unravelling of the Human Genome Project. This is Francis Collins, a Christian actually, who, I've just forgotten his title, but he was one of the leading scientists in the United States. And in the press release, they used this phrase, "Today we are learning the language in which God created life." Now, you say, well, an American president would say that. Well, maybe he would, but he's dead on, absolutely dead on. Today we are learning the language in which God created life. Francis Collins probably helped him with that statement, but there is an interesting reflection on the unravelling of the sequences in DNA.
Using computer animation based on molecular research, we are now able to see how DNA is actually copied in living cells. You are looking at an assembly line of amazing miniature biochemical machines that are pulling apart the DNA double helix and cranking out a copy of each strand. The DNA to be copied enters the production line from bottom left. The whirling blue molecular machine is called helicase. It spins the DNA as fast as a jet engine as it unwinds the double helix into 2 strands. One strand is copied continuously, and can be seen spooling off to the right. Things are not so simple for the other strand, because it must be copied backwards. It is drawn out repeatedly in loops and copied one section at a time. The end result is 2 new DNA molecules.
Now, although that's an animation, I think it gives you some idea of the levels of complexity that we are dealing with in the DNA of living things. And just think back to that quote from one of the leading scientists, you know, maybe it was a fluke. Well, that kind of sophistication, you know, the extended sophistication of these systems don't look like something you would get as a fluke. I mean, the natural conclusion is that that is intended to be that way and has been constructed or designed like that. Now, I've talked about information as perhaps the fundamental reason why I would say that there is no conflict between nature and the existence of a supreme being. But there are other examples that we'll just touch on briefly. The irreducible complexity of biological systems, what's known as cosmic fine-tuning, and our consciousness. The fact that you're all sitting here looking at me with varying opinions of the value of what I'm saying, but just the fact that you're sitting there thinking about it is a pretty remarkable thing in itself. So let's just briefly look at these other areas. This is a diagram of a single bacterium. Bacteria is a single cell, again too small for the eye to see. We have lots of bacteria in our intestine. Most of them are necessary for our digestion and for our life and health. Some are deadly, of course. But one scientist involved in this, the design movement, Michael Behe, saw a diagram of a cell of a bacterium and was intrigued by, as you see, the bacterium in this case has a tail that enables it to swim and to have motion. And what some scientists had uncovered was the molecular structure of the junction of the tail and the bacterial cell wall. And there's a diagram there just showing you what's involved, rotors and stators and bushes and hooks. And Michael Behe, I think, somewhere writes that when he first saw this, he's a biology professor in Philadelphia, he said to himself, "Jings, that's an outboard motor." And that's pretty close. You know, he thought, that's an outboard motor. There is no way that you are going to get such a sophisticated piece of kit come together by a fluke or by a random accident. Now, that's one maybe fairly trivial example. But it is an example of systems within the human body and within all living things that are irreducibly complex. How would you possibly get such a sophisticated piece of physiological machinery? How would you get that? By a fluke or by a series of accidents? They would all need to be in the same direction at the same time. And to postulate that that appears to be the result of deliberate design is, to my mind, a far more scientific conclusion than to say it is just a fluke. Or cosmic fine-tuning, what Paul Davies in his book calls the Goldilocks enigma. Why is the universe just right for life? Cosmic fine-tuning is, why is it that the laws of the universe seem to be just right for life as we know it? How did they come to be set like that? Now, one contrary argument is that we don't live in a universe, we live in a multiverse, and everything is possible somewhere in this multiverse. But of course that's mere speculation, because there's no physical evidence of any of that. Better to look at what we've got. And Paul Davies, I don't know what his ultimate conclusion is, but he says on the face of it, the universe does look as if it has been designed by an intelligent creator expressly for the purpose of spawning sentient beings. I concede that the universe at least appears to be designed with a high degree of ingenuity. And so if it appears to be designed, then why not start with the obvious point that it is designed? That would seem to be the more natural interpretation of the cosmic fine-tuning of the universe, why the laws and the forces are set with the precise values that are needed for life as we know it. Then Fred Hoyle, some decades ago, a distinguished scientist, says a common sense interpretation of the data suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with the physics as well as with the chemistry and the biology. Now, I'm not quite sure what monkeyed means, but you get his point. This looks as though somebody deliberately set this, made it to be this way. And in fact, Sir Fred Hoyle somewhere uses the phrase intelligent design long before it became as well known as it is now. And then there's the whole question of our consciousness. Just stop and think of what you're doing at the moment. You're listening to this, you're looking at me, and I don't know what you're thinking. You're thinking, this guy's off his rocker, or there's truth in this. But just think about thinking. I had a lecturer at university who tried to introduce us to thinking, and forgive me for this in a church building, but he said, once you start thinking about thinking, it's worse than drinking. Now I wouldn't know, but Trey, once you start thinking about thinking, I mean, there is something deeply impressive and profound about the ability to think. Would that come as just a kind of mere accident? How would you, without any direction or design, have conscious minds like we have and an ability to think? It is remarkable. And Thomas Nagel, in 2012, published this book, Mind and Cosmos. Look at the subtitle of it. Why the materialist neo-Darwinian conception of nature is almost certainly false. Now, I don't know where Nagel stands. I think he's probably agnostic. I don't know enough about him. But look what he says. The existence of consciousness is both one of the most familiar and one of the most astounding things about the world. And if physical science, whatever else it may have to say about the origin of life, leaves us necessarily in the dark about consciousness, that shows that it cannot provide the basic form of intelligibility for this world. And in his book, he refers to neo-Darwinism, which of course is part of the accepted scientific view that there's no design, everything as we know it just somehow evolved. He describes it as a heroic triumph of ideological theory over common sense. Now, you would understand that his book drew a lot of criticism, but from someone who is certainly agnostic and maybe even an atheist, I don't know for sure, talking about consciousness in these terms is truly remarkable. And John Lennox adds in his typical Ulster way, either human intelligence ultimately owes its origin to mindless matter, or there is a creator. It is strange that some people claim it is their intelligence that leads them to prefer the first to the second explanation. And that really is rather remarkable. So, to the question, is faith in God compatible with science? I would have to say to you, from my own experience and from looking at the material of some of these scientists that I've shown you this evening, I would have to say to you, of course it is. Of course it is compatible. In fact, not only do I think it's compatible, I think it's compelling. With the scientific background that I have, which I acknowledge is limited, but I couldn't allow myself to come to any other conclusion that there is a supreme mind and a supreme intelligence behind the universe. And just to broaden it a little, to talk about Christian faith, what reasons do we have to believe? Well, fundamentally, Christian belief is about God revealing himself in nature. But it's much more than that, of course, because it points to God manifesting himself in Christ in history, and also experiencing the Holy Spirit in our lives and in our experience. So when people say to me, why are you a Christian? I say, because I see God in nature, I know Christ in history, and I know the Holy Spirit in my experience and in the experience of others. And here are some verses from the New Testament that underline what I'm saying to you. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. Now, I would argue that that is an absolute proper representation of the world as we know it. God's invisible qualities are clearly seen. Secondly, to just go a little deeper into Christian theology, we believe that God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under law, to redeem those under law. And not only do we see God, his power and nature, but we see something of God himself in the person of Christ. And another verse, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. These are some of the qualities that the Holy Spirit will bring into a human life. Incidentally, the picture there is of William Wilberforce, whose Christian faith led him to work, as you know, for the abolition of slavery throughout the British Empire. So, a closing thought. This is a picture of the Cavendish Laboratory in Cambridge, one of the great centres of modern scientific research. And the inscription above the Cavendish Laboratory is, "Great are the works of the Lord, sought out by all who take pleasure therein." And the idea that science has banished God from our consciousness is quite bizarre, actually, because, as I've tried to argue to you, the pioneers of modern science were almost to an individual theists, and many of them were Christians. The inscription summarised Maxwell's inspiration for scientific study, the thought that the works of nature reflect the work of a designing mind. In this belief, he has been joined by many of the leading scientists of Western civilization for over 400 years. Copernicus, Kepler, Ray, Linnaeus, Cuvier, Agassiz, Boyle, Newton, Kelvin, Faraday, Rutherford, on and on the list can go. So, when you hear people say that faith is incompatible with science, you just need to step back and say, but wait a minute, it was actually people of faith that gave us science in the first place, and that's a kind of remarkable position. So, I finished by saying to you, the question posed was, is faith in God compatible with science? And I say to you, faith in God is compelled by science. Thank you for listening.